Good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics. This is your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. We're going to be busy this week. I'm meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina, and tonight all eyes are on Hurricane Delta, a powerful Category 4 storm now in the Caribbean, but it's headed for the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf Coast. And coming up, we'll tell you everything you need to know about where it's going and what the impacts will be. We'll have help from meteorologists in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and others here in Raleigh. But first, the very latest from the National Hurricane Center. I've got a long list of historical records that we have accumulated so far this year, and unfortunately, Delta is adding to that list. This is the 9th hurricane of the year. Later this week, when it makes landfall on the Gulf Coast, it'll be the 10th landfalling named storm this year. This is already the 3rd Category 4 hurricane, and there are more records to come, unfortunately. Here's the very latest from the National Hurricane Center. I have the statistics up here in the right, along with the live plot of one of the many Hurricane Hunter aircrafts that have been and will be investigating this storm. More on that in a second. But the 8 o'clock update did not change, which is big news because since this thing formed Sunday night as a depression with 35-mile-per-hour winds, every time you've heard anyone talk about the storm, they could always lead with, it's stronger again, it's stronger again. It has continued that, which is what brought it to the 145-mile-per-hour Category 4 monster that it is now. This is the first time, really, that we haven't seen an increase. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be more, but right now it's kind of a nice relief that there hasn't been an increase. Winds are gusting to 175 miles per hour. Pressure hasn't changed a whole lot today, but remember, that's been going way down, and it's moving west-northwest at 17 miles per hour. So let's do the eye test. Let's take a step back and look at the satellite composition. This storm looks like a Category 4 storm now. It's more symmetrical, it's more round, and that is bad news for our friends in the Yucatan Peninsula, the resort areas of Cancun and Cozumel. They could have their strongest hurricane strike in 13 years early tomorrow morning. This is Tuesday night, and they are getting ready right now. The Hurricane Hunter aircraft, it's a unique path, and you may be wondering, well, why the heck is the Hurricane Hunter flying in the Gulf of Mexico when there's nothing there yet? So they took off from Lackland Air Force Base in western Florida, just outside of Tampa. And what they're doing, kind of on their way, they're sampling all the atmosphere in the Gulf of Mexico where this storm is headed next. All that information is going to get fed into the computer models. We're going to break that down a little later. This is all in an effort to help us get a better idea of where this is going so we can warn people and evacuate them if we need to. Tonight, they're circling the storm. There'll be another flight headed in, and it's interesting, the next flight is going to come out of Biloxi, but that's where the second base is for the Hurricane Hunters. They're having to evacuate that Air Force Base because that's one of the places this storm could go next. So they'll take off from Biloxi, they'll go down there, and then they'll come back to Houston, just outside of the military base outside of Houston. So that's the very latest. Let's kind of put all this into motion for you. And, you know, when we all got up this morning, it was a strengthening Cat 1, Cat 2 hurricane. And as we get ready for bed tonight, it's a Category 4 storm. Again, it's got a nice symmetrical look. All right, the outer rain bands have already started to reach Cancun and Cozumel. They pretty much shut everything down this afternoon. They might be able to reopen in 24 hours, but that just depends on how bad the damage is. So unfortunately, this is going to clip just a small amount of land, so it's not going to have a whole lot of time to decrease in intensity because of land, which is bad because then it heads into the warm Gulf of Mexico and could stay a very strong storm as it heads for, once again, our friends in Louisiana. So again, it's a Category 4 hurricane now with 145 mile per hour. It's most likely going to strengthen in the overnight hours before it makes landfall sometime around daybreak on Wednesday morning. A couple hours before, a couple hours after, depending on the speed. Then it'll be over land for a very short amount of time, could weaken a little bit, but then re-strengthen back to a Category 4 by Thursday afternoon. Again, today's Tuesday, so we're talking 48 hours from now. And then sometime late Friday night, making landfall on the coast of Louisiana, anywhere between the state line of Texas all the way over to New Orleans. Everyone is all still in play for this major hurricane. So let's kind of take a closer look in and time it out exactly. 2 landfalls with this one. One for Mexico. That most likely is going to happen in the early morning hours tomorrow as a Category 4 hurricane. Again, Wednesday at 5 a.m. This is the forecast track from the Hurricane Center of where this storm could be. Then it's going to spend a couple days over the warm water of the Gulf of Mexico, and then sometime Friday night making landfall anywhere between, let's say, Beaumont, Texas and New Orleans. Remember, that's what this cone means. The center of the storm could be anywhere inside this cone, here, or here at this time frame. This is not the largest storm we've ever seen as far as area, but it is a powerful one, and it's going to create a lot of problems, including for our friends in Cancun. I've got a couple cameras that I'm going to keep an eye on over the course of the next 48 hours just to see what happens. Here's a live look from the Royal Resort in Cancun, Mexico. I know it's dark there now, but the ocean's right out there. There's the beach with the palm trees. There is the pool with the lights on now. We'll see if they keep water. Obviously, no one around the pool bar because they have evacuated and shut everything down. So it is going to be a very interesting 24 hours and then on to later this week when the storm heads for the United States. Let's bring in our first guest tonight to help us break down the storm even more. WBTW Chief Meteorologist Frank Johnson. Frank, we're going to talk about some of the more notable October storms in history a little bit later, but Hurricane Delta is going to be just that, a notable historic storm, unfortunately. Let's just start off your overall thoughts on what's happened over the past 48 hours with this massive hurricane.
Well, it already is kind of historic with the rapid intensification that we saw today. It is a very powerful storm, but one of the unique things about this storm so far is that it is actually very small. The radius of winds, very compact, though very strong. In fact, the eye, notice you can't see it on the infrared satellite picture here. It's only about 4 or 5 miles across. This is a tiny eye on this storm. That will likely change, especially by the time it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. But right now we're dealing with a very small but very powerful hurricane, and it will continue to move off to the northwest fairly quickly. Once it slows down in the Gulf of Mexico, that's when it's going to have a chance to get a little bit bigger as well. But I think as it makes landfall early tomorrow morning in northern parts of the Yucatan Peninsula near the tourist areas, the forecast is for 155-mile-per-hour winds. That's right on the cusp of Category 5. So we could be looking at a strong Category 4 or even a Category 5 when this makes landfall tomorrow morning in Mexico.
Frank, good point about the size, but that doesn't matter. Remember Andrew back in '92, one of the only few Category 5 hurricanes that's ever hit the United States. Andrew was really small. That doesn't matter with this storm because as we're seeing 145-mile-per-hour winds, what happens once it gets into the Gulf? Because it's going to be a whole different ball game. The Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, I know they're both big, warm ocean bodies, but it's going to be different once it gets into the Gulf, right?
Yeah, and that's what we're watching for because the computer models on this, they're all fairly consistent right now. They're taking it off to the northwest into the Yucatan Peninsula. And then as we head toward the later part of the week into Friday morning, notice how many of the computer models are grouped right across central parts of Louisiana. And like you mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean that's where it's going because some of the computer models are further west, some are further east. You mentioned Beaumont to New Orleans, which is a pretty good range here between the computer models, but they're all clustered right in there in central parts of Louisiana, the Atchafalaya Basin there, which does flood very often. So we're going to be watching that. Imagine if it goes a little further west to the Lake Charles area. Of course, they're still recovering from Hurricane Laura, which was a major hurricane. They do not need a second major hurricane. So I think if it's going to make landfall, right in there, it's better than the New Orleans area with a heavy population and where they've already gotten hit in the Lake Charles area. But there are some big cities in here, the Atchafalaya Basin, up toward Lake Charles. There's high population in there as well.
Yeah, Frank, you know, one of the things our friends in Louisiana are concerned about are the winds. You're going to talk about the storm surge and the waves in a second, but behind me now I have when they're expecting winds to deteriorate. Remember, this is now Tuesday, so by Friday at lunchtime, that's when we're expecting the tropical storm force winds to reach our friends in Louisiana. So that's just one of the many problems. Heavy rain is going to be one, but let's talk a little bit about the storm surge and how the waves are going to be different in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, and this is all based on the size of the hurricane. Like we noticed we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it's currently a very small hurricane size-wise. That doesn't matter as far as damage is concerned. 145-mile-per-hour winds are still going to do a lot of damage, but that radius of waves, the high waves that will really push that storm surge, fairly small right now in the Caribbean. Watch what happens as this moves into the Gulf of Mexico. Once the storm starts to slow down in the Gulf, it is going to get a lot bigger in size, and a larger wind field is going to kick up a much larger area of large, dangerous waves. In fact, Thursday evening, this is almost or more than half of the Gulf of Mexico that has higher than 8-foot waves. Those large waves going far ahead of the storm are going to start that storm surge early. The Texas Gulf Coast, the Louisiana coast, even as far east as Pensacola, they may see a 3, 4, 5-foot storm surge starting on Thursday. That's important because if you're planning on evacuating the day before, a lot of the low-lying areas right along the coast, because of those large waves and that storm surge, may start earlier than the storm before it comes in. And then once it moves into Louisiana, we've got the rough waves, and things tend to calm down a little bit by the weekend. But a larger size storm in the Gulf of Mexico has huge implications with the waves and what those waves do with the storm surge.
Yeah, storm surge. We talked about the winds. Behind me now, Frank, I've got the forecast rain totals. And remember, like you said, this is multiple hurricane hits for them this year. So they still got way too much water in the ground. I mean, Cameron, Louisiana, which is where the last hurricane made landfall, over 9 inches. Lake Charles. That's that picture that everyone saw of the actual radar dome at the National Weather Service got obliterated, knocked off. They're going to get close to 7 inches. Beaumont, Texas, right on the other side of the state line, almost 8.5 inches. About 5 inches in Lafayette. Again, these are just estimates. We still have several days to go. And listen, Frank, we're a week into October. And, you know, it seems to me years ago, we used to be able to cruise into October and say, okay, things are finally calming down in the hurricane center, in the hurricane season. We're proving that's not the case anymore. And, I mean, you've got a lot of examples to show us otherwise, right?
Yeah, October used to be my favorite month. Now it seems that it's a very busy tropical month. The peak of hurricane season last month in September, we talked about September 10th being the peak of hurricane season. Here we are into October. We're on the downside, and it will continue to get lighter and lighter heading into November. But we still have a lot of hurricanes across the Atlantic especially the first half of October. And there have been some very historic hurricanes. They generally form in the Western Caribbean, like we've noticed with Delta. But what we're looking for October tropical formation, we no longer really see those storms that form as tropical waves off of Africa and maintain themselves across the entire Atlantic Ocean. In October, many of the storms form in the western parts of the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, or the southwestern Atlantic off of the Carolina coast. This is the area where we see more of our storms form. And as far as motion, they start to move backwards. In the summertime, the peak of hurricane season, they move from east to west. As we get to October and November, they generally move from west to east. The ones that form in the Western Caribbean may get into the Gulf and start to move off to the east across Florida. And there's a second area where we see a cluster of formation in the Western Atlantic off the east coast of the United States. These ones tend to form and move out to sea. They don't always move out to sea. Sometimes we see them hook back onto the east coast. That can be really devastating because that's really not what we look for when we look for tropical storms. We look for them to move in and then move back out again.
Yeah, and Frank, some of the more recent memorable storms are M-named storms. We have to remind ourselves that we're on the Greek alphabet. We've made it to 25 named storms. Let's back up a few letters. We had some pretty historic storms in the last few years that started with M, which seems like so long ago in the name list this year.
Yeah, I know it. And those M storms we're talking about, a couple of historic hurricanes that formed during the month of October. Hurricane Michael, this was just 2 years ago. That was that Category 5 storm that hit Mexico Beach, Florida. Of course, it caused $25 billion in damage in the U.S. Very strong, powerful storm that really got going right before landfall, and it did kill 75 people. That was a major hurricane, a Category 5 that made landfall, just one of only a handful of Category 5s. Also, back 4 years ago, Hurricane Matthew, we remember this one. In 2015, we had the 1,000-year flood across South Carolina, across the Carolinas. The next year, we had Hurricane Matthew. Now, it was just a Category 1. It made landfall in McClellanville, South Carolina, but it dumped a tremendous amount of rain, caused over $15 billion in the United States, and it was a flood that rivaled the one we had just the year before in 2015. 585 deaths. 500 of those, over 500, happened in Haiti. It really was a disaster for Haiti. It was a major hurricane down there. Luckily, it weakened as it headed toward the Carolinas, but it was still a big storm for us.
Yeah, and up here too, you know, the statistics I always like to remind people of, Matthew never actually made landfall in North Carolina. The eye never came into our state, but it did so much damage, and that's just another point that we always try to make, is it doesn't really matter where the eye is, because these storms are huge and they create a lot of problems. You know, some other famous storms that I know we remember from history: Sandy, Hazel. I mean, those storms happened in October. A lot of people forget about those.
Yeah, and let's go through the list here. I've got 7 of them. We've hit 2 of them so far. Here's Hurricane Sandy. This is one that that really devastated parts of Cuba into Bahamas as well. It weakened in the Bahamas, but then it got going up again across the western parts of the Atlantic. Like we saw the normal paths that these storms take, it should have stayed out to sea, but this is one that hooked back into New Jersey. Now, technically, Sandy wasn't officially a tropical system when it made landfall. Right before landfall, the Hurricane Center classified it as an extratropical storm, but it made landfall in Brigantine, New Jersey, as a Category 1 force storm. It wasn't technically a hurricane. However, it was a large storm size-wise, and it was fairly slow-moving. It had huge storm surges across New Jersey and New York and caused $74.1 billion of damage. This is one of the costliest hurricanes we have ever had, even though it was only a Category 1. And there were 233 deaths with Hurricane Sandy as well. And then how about Hurricane Wilma? This is a monster that formed in the Western Caribbean back in 2005. It scraped by Cancun and Cozumel, the areas that we're watching for Hurricane Delta. It was a major Category 5 hurricane. In fact, it was the strongest hurricane ever measured in the Atlantic basin as far as pressure is concerned. Now, Hurricane Allen back in 1980 had stronger winds, but 183-mile-per-hour winds peak. Costliest hurricane in Mexico history, because it did hit those tourist areas, the resort towns. It did hit Florida as a major hurricane as well. It was a Category 3 as it moves through southwestern Florida. That really devastated the Bonita Springs, Naples area, and it made landfall in Cape Romano, Florida. Almost $30 billion in damage in the United States. Going back a few years from that, Hurricane Mitch, 1998, this was a devastating hurricane for Central America. It was a powerful storm, a major hurricane, but it's really known for its ridiculous rainfall amounts. It really slowed down before making landfall, stalled right off of Central America, and only slowly went through, dumping a lot of rain. This one is the second deadliest hurricane in Atlantic history. Over 20,000 people killed because of the rain, the flooding, and the mudslides in Central America. Historic rainfall amounts. When it did hit Florida, they had a 4-foot storm surge on the Florida Keys, and it produced a bunch of tornadoes that did damage across Florida as well. But this one is really remembered for the tremendous flooding and the killing flooding across Central America. In 1995, Hurricane Opal, Category 3, slammed into Pensacola. Killed 9 people in the United States, $5.1 billion. That was an October landfall as well. And going way back, 1954, of course, one of the historic Carolina hurricanes, Hurricane Hazel, Category 4, made landfall at the North Carolina-South Carolina border. That still stands as the record for the furthest north a Category 4 hurricane has made landfall. This one killed 95 people in the U.S., 469 people in Haiti. It was a horrible hurricane down in Haiti, killed a lot of people down there. And look at this in Canada, 81 people died in Canada. This is remembered as a tremendous hurricane up in Toronto. Their worst floods and one of their worst windstorms up there as well. So just a tremendous hurricane. This one is still remembered here in South Carolina for all the damage it did. And it was an October storm as well.
People sometimes move to Canada to get away from hurricanes, and they couldn't do that in Hazel. Frank, I counted, I wasn't exactly sure. The M-name storm is 13 letters in. So you had Mitch and Matthew and Michael in October. We're at 25, so just an incredibly historic season that we are living through, and we're not done. We still got 2 months to go almost.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this Hurricane Delta looks like it is going to be one of these nasty ones that will probably get added to this list.
Yeah, unfortunately. Good stuff. Great breakdown of Delta and, of course, our historic October storms. That is Frank Johnson down in Myrtle Beach at WBTW. Frank, we'll talk to you down the road. Thanks so much.
All right, good seeing you, Wes.
All right, like October has started, September was an historically wild month of storms. From Tropical Storm Renee forming in the first week of September to ending in the Greek alphabet with Tropical Storm Gamma. Melissa Lefevre has more on the record-breaking month of September.
Although September ended in a tropical lull, the month was nothing short of busy. September saw 10 named storms, which was the most on record for any September. Those storms included Nana, Omar, Paulette, Renee, Sally, Teddy, Vicky, Wilfred, Alpha, and Beta. All of those were the earliest to form on record. Friday, September 18th was the busiest day of the month, where we had 3 of those storms develop. Tropical Storm Wilfred, which rounded out the official name list for the year. And then we went Greek with Subtropical Storm Alpha and Tropical Storm Beta. There has only been one other day that 3 storms developed on the same day, and that was back on August 15th, 1893. Another number to remember is 9. Beta became the 9th system to make landfall in the U.S. this year, which ties the all-time record of U.S. landfalls in any season. That occurred back in 1916. 4 of those were hurricanes. That includes Hannah, Isaias, Laura, and Sally. And we also had 5 tropical storms make landfall: Bertha, Cristobal, Faye, Marco, and most recently, Beta. Now, through September, the 2020 season had a total of 23 named storms, with 20 of those the earliest to form on record. That is second only to 2005 with 28 named storms. Now, although we can put this historic September behind us, there is still plenty of time left in the season. October is the 3rd most active month in the Atlantic, behind only September and August. The Atlantic hurricane season officially runs through November 30th.
Good stuff, Melissa. And again, thanks for being with us tonight on Tracking the Tropics. If you missed it off the top, we have a Category 4 hurricane in the Western Caribbean with eyes set on the Cancun area overnight tonight, remaining a Category 4 with 145-mile-per-hour winds. It's actually forecast to get a little stronger, possibly up to 155-mile-per-hour winds. That will put it on the verge of being a Category 5 hurricane when it hits Cancun in the early morning hours of Wednesday, tomorrow morning. So just to recap where we have been this season, remember, it started before June with Arthur, and we have now gone through 21 of the previously agreed upon names, and now 4 in the Greek alphabet for a total of 25. Epsilon is next on the list, by the way, but there's nothing out there that we're thinking about or that the National Hurricane Center is keeping an eye on. But to update and finish with what Melissa just said, so we are now up to 25, just 3 away from the all-time record of number of named storms, which, as we all remember, was back in 2005. So we'll take a breath. We will pause and continue to keep an eye on Hurricane Delta. We want to thank you for spending part of your night with us here. Hurricane Delta will be around all week long. So will we. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place, Tracking the Tropics. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Hohenstein. Good night.